Progressives aren't going to like that this bill makes E-Verify a requirement for the industry. And conservatives hard on immigration aren't going to like that it gives farm workers a path to legal status.
Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Today we'll talk a little bit about a controversial proposal about how Yakima elects its mayor and digging into the signs of earthquake risks in eastern Washington. First, we start with Enrique Perez de la Rosa in Yakima. Thanks for being here today, Enrique.
Thanks for having me.
So, Enrique, catch us up on a little bit of a background here and what's going on with the way Yakima elects its mayor and a proposal to change that.
Yeah, so back in November, the city council voted to put a government change to voters. Right now, voters elect candidates to represent their district in the council, and then the council chooses a president to lead the council. And that president has the title of mayor, but really they're just a president. They're follow Robert's rules and such. The person with actual executive power in Yakima city government is the city manager, and they're hired by the council to run their government day to day, do hiring, do firing, things like that. So the proposal was to change that system to replace essentially the city manager with an elected mayor as top executive. And proponents of the proposal, which include a former mayor, a county commissioner, they say people have a right to choose who their chief executive is, but civil rights organizations like the ACLU, Columbia Legal Services, and One America, they have come forward in letters and in city council meetings saying that they worry that citywide elections will disenfranchise Latinx voters. And that motivated them to file lawsuits against the city on Tuesday, not actually about what is in the content of the proposal, but because they said the proposal didn't meet ballot title requirements and that the proposal itself was unconstitutional because it was being put to voters by the city in a special election when voter turnout is really low.
Okay, so let's step back. There is some historical context here, some important historical context. Back to 2014 involving a lawsuit and the Federal Voting Rights Act that eventually made changes to how Yakima elects not only a mayor, but the city council members. Give us some of that historical context.
Yeah, so the system of government was largely the same as it is now, but the way that candidates got elected was very different. Candidates would run in primaries and get votes from people in their district, but then their district races would turn citywide. And so what that meant was that people from every district were voting on races happening in every other district. And that in and of itself isn't a problem, but because Yakima is so segregated with most Latinx residents living on the east side, that meant that candidates from those districts wouldn't make it to the council. And actually no Latinx candidates ever made it to the Yakima City Council before this lawsuit. That was until 2014 when 3 Latina candidates got elected after federal court sided with the ACLU on that Voting Rights Act lawsuit. And they agreed that citywide council elections disenfranchise Latinx residents, but the question now is whether that would also apply to mayoral elections.
Well, interesting context there. Thanks for the history lesson, and we'll be watching it as it goes forward. So let's move on to other news in the other Washington. You might say in Washington, D.C. Believe it or not, there is more than just impeachment going on, and Congress is still functioning in its normal legislative role, even though we don't maybe hear as much given all the news of late. So to that end, the Farm Worker Modernization Act is working its way through the House of Representatives. There's, of course, a lot of farm workers in the Northwest, and so it's very relevant and important here. What is going on with that act, and what's in it, frankly?
Yeah, so if signed into law, the bill would do several things for both farm workers and the people that employ them. One, it gives qualified farm workers a 5-year renewable work visas and a path to permanent resident status. That's a big deal for a lot of people. For farmers, it gives improvements to the H-2A system, which is a visa program that farmers use to bring migrant workers from places like Mexico. The bill makes the process simpler, makes housing for workers cheaper, and creates a new 3-year visa program that would let farmers bring in migrants for year-round work. And that one's really useful for the dairy industry, for example, who need workers year-round. It also makes E-Verify mandatory for the agricultural system, and that's a system that employers use to verify a worker's immigration status.
It's worth noting that this is actually a pretty bipartisan measure in the House, not just about Republicans, not just from Democrats. In fact, all three members of Congress who represent Central and Eastern Washington are co-sponsoring. That's Democrat Kim Schreier and Republicans Kathy McMorris Rodgers and Dan Newhouse, who represents Central Washington and parts of Yakima and the Tri-Cities. So tell us more about what Dan Newhouse in particular has been saying for this act.
So Newhouse says this bill is good news for farmers because it creates a stable and legal workforce, and it gives relief to farmers and ranchers across the country. He emphasized that it's not a perfect solution, and that's something that's been said on both sides of the aisle on this bill for different reasons. Progressives aren't going to like that this bill makes E-Verify a requirement for the industry. And conservatives hard on immigration aren't going to like that it gives farm workers a path to legal status. But as Newhouse said when the U.S. House voted on this recently, it's a significant improvement over the status quo. It has passed the U.S. House, and now it's going over to the Senate, so it'll be interesting to see how the bill performs in a chamber that's a lot more conservative.
It certainly will, and we appreciate you catching us up, and we'll look forward to more news as it comes out and progresses through Congress. Enrique, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And now we turn to NWPB correspondent Courtney Flatt in the Tri-Cities. She's going to talk a little bit about shaking going on, or possible future shaking, and the search for signs of that. Thanks for being here, Courtney.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
So, Courtney, we hear a lot about the Cascadia subduction zone, of course, and its impacts, potential impacts on the west side of the Cascades. But geologists are digging more into fault zones or potential fault zones on the east side of the Cascades and what that means. And you recently covered that and caught up with them in a big trench. What are they looking for, and what did you find?
Sure. So I was basically in between Pasco and Walla Walla, and USGS geologists are studying the Wallula Fault. And so they dug a 90 by 12-foot trench. The way they dug that was they dug it over what's called a scarp, and it to you or me would look like a rolling bump kind of in the ground. You might not even notice it, but to geologists, it's really pretty obvious. It's where one part of the fault has slid up relative to the other part of the fault, and they can follow this particular scarp from Wallula Gap all the way to Walla Walla, which is about 12 miles. And once they got inside the trench, they were able to kind of study the different layers of sediment, and they could see things like the Missoula floods all the way up to modern day dirt. Once they were in there, they found ash, and what they did was they collected that ash, and they're hoping to be able to date it so they can look at it and figure out more about when this particular scarp was formed. They think it dates back about 10,000 years. That might sound like a lot, but it actually is really not that long of a time in geologic time, and it means that this particular fault is active and potentially hazardous for nearby communities.
Well, just so we're clear, this isn't necessarily new information or a new find, correct? Like, geologists have known about these faults in eastern Washington for a long time. They're just doing more study of them. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So in the 1990s, this laser imaging technology called LiDAR was invented. And so that really helped geologists kind of be able to see and understand more about what's going on underneath our feet. They know of at least 10 fault zones in eastern Washington that are 40 miles long or longer. And those are fault zones that could cause significant damage to nearby communities. And so what they hope to do with this new study, they eventually want to map all of the faults in eastern Washington, and that way they can provide risk assessment for people to say when a particular fault could rupture and what that would mean for nearby communities. So that's going to take a while, but the technology will help them get there a lot faster.
That's good to know, and of course good to be prepared. I should also note that Courtney recently did some reporting on the infrastructure of Central Washington dams and earthquake risks there. So good reporting on that, and thank you for sharing all this information with us, Courtney, and for being here today.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you to Courtney and Enrique for sharing those stories today. You can see more on them and others at nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.